Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Karen Levitov, Director and Curator of Zuccaire Gallery at Staller Center, and it's really wonderful to welcome you here to our panel discussion, Indigenous Arts and Environmental Issues. This is the last program of our exhibition, Connecting the Drops, The Power of Water, which is on view next door in the Staller Center here right next door. And I'm happy to welcome you after the panel discussion to a reception in the gallery. Before introducing our panelists, I'd like to acknowledge that Stony Brook University campuses occupy the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the territory of the Selk'nam and Shinnecock peoples. We acknowledge federal and state recognized tribes who live here now and those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experience. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Drs. Barry and Bobby Kohler, whose generosity has made this program possible. I'm also very happy that this program is co-sponsored by the Humanities Institute of Stony Brook, and I thank them, and that it is part of the university's celebration of Native American Heritage Month. And now I'm very pleased to welcome our moderator and panelists to the stage, and I will read their biographies as they come on to the stage. Okay. Courtney M. Leonard is an artist and filmmaker who has contributed to the offshore art movement. Leonard's current work embodies the multiple definitions of breach, an exploration and documentation of historical ties to water, whale, and material sustainability. In collaboration with national and international museums, cultural institutions, and indigenous communities in North America, New Zealand, Nova Scotia, and the United States embassies. Leonard's practice investigates narratives of cultural viability as a reflection of environmental record. Welcome, Courtney. Erin Genia is a multidisciplinary artist, educator, and community organizer specializing in Native American and Indigenous arts and culture. Genia's work in these areas is focused on amplifying the powerful presence of Indigenous people in the arts, sciences, and public realm to invoke an evolution of thought and practice that is aligned with the cycles of the natural world and the potential of humanity. Welcome, Erin. Dr. Pikitch is an award-winning scientist, conservationist, and communicator who is transforming the way the ocean is regarded and managed. She is the inaugural Endowed Professor of Ocean Conservation Science at the School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences at Stony Brook University and directs its Institute for Ocean Conservation Science. She has conducted research and restoration efforts in Shinnecock Bay for more than a decade and led the successful effort to have Shinnecock Bay designated as an internationally significant hope spot. Welcome, Ellen. Shavonne F. Smith is the director of the Shinnecock Nation Environmental Department and has served her community for 16 years. Her work includes teaming with dedicated staff to implement aquaculture, water quality monitoring, natural science resource management, crop cultivation, and climate resilience programming. Additionally, she serves on 3 national committees: the National Tribal Caucus, National Tribal Toxics Council, and the E-Enterprise Leadership Council. Welcome, Shavonne. And last but not least is our esteemed moderator, Dr. Abena Asare, Associate Professor in the Department of Africana Studies and History here at Stony Brook, with a long list of other accolades that you can look up online. Welcome, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you to the Staller Center. We are really excited to have our wonderful, esteemed guest joining us today as we acknowledge the reality that we are in a university that is located on stolen land. I would invite us to think about what that means as we encounter all of these speakers' work. What does this produce in terms of the possibilities as well as the limits of our conversation today? What does this mean as we seek to take something specific back from this interaction? So I want to turn the floor over to our first presenter, who will be Courtney. or Erin. Erin is going to present first. Thank you.
Thank you, Abena. Thank you, Karen, and thank you, everyone. It's really exciting to be here. I want to make sure this is set up. My name is Erin Genia, and let's get my slides going. I'm a tribal member of the Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate, which is a Dakota tribe. Our reservation is located in what is today known as South Dakota and Minnesota and North Dakota. I have a Master of Science in Art, Culture, and Technology from Massachusetts Institute of Technology and an MPA Tribal Governance from the Evergreen State College. I'm an artist, and I have a wide-ranging practice that includes sculpture, ceramics, sound, performance, public art, and traditional Dakota art forms. I also do community-based organizing as well as Native arts and culture advocacy, and I also teach. Much of my work does engage with water, and as you can see here on the slide, I have a picture of a mural that I did called Wakpa, which is the Dakota word for river. It's depicting the Mystic River in Massachusetts. And it was on the side of the building at the Tufts University Art Galleries. Okay. So I wanted to start off talking about a project that I completed as a 2020 artist in residence for the city of Boston. I was embedded at the time with the Department of Emergency Management, and it happened right as the pandemic started. And I was able to witness how the city agency sprang into action to address this serious public health emergency. And I was also, that time, as we all have gone through such a hard time during the pandemic, there was so many things going on at that time as well, including institutional racism, which is ongoing, but was coming up through the Black Lives Matter movement. There was increased things happening in terms of climate change with fires raging and increase in storms. And so I really had time to think as an artist and to reflect and to think about how my practice would engage with these topics. And so what I thought about was that we're really in an emergency that is based in our culture. And so I developed this project called Cultural Emergency Response to help me and others understand crises from a more systemic cultural perspective. And so I developed a whole body of work around this, and these are just two examples of my work, which one is a sort of a reimagined graphic of the city of Boston's seal with sea level rise, because Boston is a ground zero site of climate change. It's also a ground zero site of colonization. And so I did a lot of work around that as well, thinking about that. And depicted here, I was able to do some public art that discussed the importance of Indigenous presence in Boston and in particular stories. So in this image here, you can see me building the water spirit of Ontehi, which is a Dakota water monster that's emerging from the land at Boston University. So in thinking about what a cultural emergency is it's a state of crises brought about by the philosophical and cultural practices of our society. How we think determines how we act in the world. It determines our culture, and it can create harmful byproducts, such as environmental racism, which is something that my tribe deals with a lot. Ecological destruction, mass extinctions. I mean, the list goes on that our culture is producing these harmful byproducts that lead to crises for people and for other creatures. And so embedded in this framework, which you can actually look at on the boston.gov website, which was, I was able to put everything up there, my recommendation is that solutions to any of these emergencies, whether they be the climate crisis, water crisis, all of these things, it requires no less than a deeply cultural critique and response. And so I leave that then to you to think about what does that mean? So if you had the opportunity to look at the show in the gallery, you would see one of my pieces there called Earthling. And Earthling is a piece that actually was created out of frustration. I wanted to channel my own frustration working as a community organizer on environmental justice issues, because I would always come up against sort of this, what I think of as a paradigmatic dissonance as a Dakota person, and coming up and sort of witnessing how non-Native people view the environment, from my perspective, as something separate. There's a profound separateness from nature in Western thought and philosophy that elevates humans, and then certain kinds of humans, as better or more deserving than other forms of life and existence. And that's just so counter to what I know as a Dakota person, because our culture, it has been built on, for thousands of years, built upon the concept of mitakuye oyasin, which means all our relations. And it means that not only are we all related here, we're related to our families, we're related to other people, we're related to other creatures, animals, plants, but that everything in existence, rocks, water, air, electricity, all of these things are considered to have life. That they're considered, and as such, they're treated with the respect that they deserve. And so I created Earthling to express the fact that we're not just a part of the earth, we actually are the earth. We are part of the earth's body. And so what does that mean? How should we act if we can come around to that realization of that reality? And I always think of how to embed my work with a Dakota philosophical approach. And there's a lot of Dakota practitioners that you can look at, including Vine Deloria Jr., which I highly recommend everyone read his works. And so this quote that's from God is Read is something that I think is important to think about as we consider the environment. The imminent and expected destruction of the life cycle of world ecology can be prevented by a radical shift in outlook from our present naive conception of this world as a testing ground of abstract morality to a more mature view of the universe as a comprehensive matrix of life forms. It's such a Dakota thing to say. So there's a lot of things that you can look at and read about that's coming out of our people. So these are two other pieces that you can see in the show. One of them is a medicine pouch that is made with quill work and beadwork, and the other is a painting that depicts the morning star. I use the morning star a lot in my work because it really, there's so much embedded into this iconography that it just is very complex, and it speaks to Dakota worldview. As part of the U.S. assimilation policies here in this settler colonial state, our culture, in particular Dakota culture, has, like many indigenous nations across this continent, have faced the destruction of our languages. And so it's a responsibility that I have to try to learn my language and to try to use it as much as I can. So there are two words here that I'd like to share with you today. One is ihpea, and the other is piechpichashni. Ihpea means to discard or throw away. And with this term, I think of the increasing number of places on Earth that are spent or trashed, destroyed, detonated. Piechpichashni means to be broken beyond repair, unfixable. And this is something that I think about when I think of Western philosophies of separation from nature, the hierarchy of man, and how this has been compounded over hundreds of years of dominance to create widespread ecological and climate crises. So a philosophy that is fundamentally not in alignment with nature. How do we deal with this? What do we do? Well, indigenous philosophies and practices have to be respected, and they have to be present as decision makers in all forums. So that's really what I think has to happen. And I have a lot of questions about technological solutions to the water crises, to the climate crises. What is the price that we pay for these technological solutions? Are we displacing one problem for another set of problems? Is there a way to factor in future deficits to water, health, ecosystems? And if those deficits can be part of the equation, what would the result be? Would these technological advances be worth it? So ultimately, I guess my main question is, can we shift our values, our cultural practices, towards investment in future generation wellness for all beings? And I have just one more. Well, I have a lot to share, but oops. I want to just give a little bit of about relationship to place, because that's something that I always think about as an Indigenous person, wherever I am. Whose land am I on, and what am I doing here to highlight what has happened here? How am I helping or addressing Indigenous issues and settler colonialism? But I'll share a bit about my relationship to this place here. Is that I grew up for a time here in Stony Brook, and my grandfathers are the reason why I'm here. On the left side, you can see my grandfather, James Shea. He was an Irish immigrant, and I grew up with him on the water. He loved fishing. He loved going to shell fishing, and we would do that together. He taught me how to do all of that. So my love of water comes from him. And then here is my other grandfather, Howard Genia. He was an Ottawa man from Michigan. He was a nuclear scientist. He worked at Brookhaven National Laboratory. And our family story goes that he basically stopped a nuclear reactor meltdown by exposing himself to radiation in order to fix a problem. He was an engineer. And he died of leukemia. I never got to know him. And he was a brilliant and brave man. And I have since learned about many people who worked at Brookhaven National Laboratory who did also got leukemia and other forms of cancer. And so just thinking about these technologies and the impact of those things. So I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Erin. Next, we'll hear from Ellen.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about environmental issues in a place that is very special to me, very special to Long Island, and very special to many of the people on this panel. And it's a place called Shinnecock Bay. Shinnecock Bay is on the southeast shore of Long Island. It's the home of the Shinnecock Indian Nation. It also is a place where generations of baymen have plied the waters and supported their families on what they've been able to obtain from the bay. And it's a place that when I first came out here and learned about it, it was in great decline and had degraded amazingly. It was in basically a death spiral. And my story today is really a story of hope. That today, this year, Shinnecock Bay has been named a hope spot by an international organization called Mission Blue. And this places Shinnecock Bay in the same league as iconic places such as the Ross Sea in Antarctica, the Galapagos Islands, where Darwin discovered evolution, the Sargasso Sea. These are places that most people have heard of, but not many people had heard of Shinnecock Bay. And hopefully this designation will elevate the importance and the knowledge about Shinnecock Bay to the world. Shinnecock Bay is a beacon of hope because of the things that have happened there. And I will quickly go through what has happened. So again, this is the bay. It's ecologically significant, it's regionally significant. It's 9,000 acres of open water. It has a very diverse, not only human population, but population of species. And it's a shallow water bay that is very vulnerable to environmental degradation. What we saw was, because of too much harvest, too much extracted from the bay, too much habitat destruction, and poor water quality, we saw that the clams, the oysters, the scallops, these were very important, not just as organisms in the bay, but as food for all kinds of people, had declined so dramatically that we barely had an industry anymore, just within the last few decades. So I'm going to tell you a story of hope. It's a story of a restoration project that started about 10 years ago. Before the restoration, when you would look at Shinnecock Bay, you would often see water that looked like this. Water that is brown, water that sunlight can't penetrate through, and it's called brown tide. It's caused by a harmful algae, and that algae was fueled by inputs of fertilizers and nitrogen and other inputs into Shinnecock Bay that many of us people caused. The reduced penetration of sunlight not only led to problems with certain species, but it led to the loss of one of the most important species in the bay, something called eelgrass or seagrass. This is a species of plant, aquatic plant, that all of the life within Shinnecock Bay depends upon. Fish depend on it as nursery areas, breeding areas, areas where they could be safe from predation. And just like other plants require light to grow, when the brown tides came, the eelgrass died, and because they no longer had light. Another one of the harmful algal blooms that was really concerning is something called red tide. Red tide is a human health hazard, and it can cause something called paralytic shellfish poisoning if you consume shellfish that are in red tide. And this can cause permanent nerve damage and can be fatal to people. That's pretty serious, when you have impacts like that, where we can have a harmful algal bloom that's actually fatal, can be fatal to people. And nearly half of Shinnecock Bay had to be closed to fishing for the first half of the last decade because of these red tides. It's really scary, wouldn't you say? Certainly scared me. So in the face of this degradation, what does a scientist do? Well, different scientists might have different approaches, but my work has always gone beyond science to conservation. When I see a problem, my inclination is, let's try to fix it. And we were able to put together a program called the Shinnecock Bay Restoration Program. There are many colleagues of mine at Stony Brook University and SOMAS who have been important parts of this program. And we devised a restoration program that had hard clam sanctuaries as the heart of the restoration strategy. Now I want to say, Erin brought up the idea of nuclear power being sort of an alien approach that can have really bad consequences of its own. Our approach was a nature-based solution. We put back in the water hard clams that were of spawning age and were native to that area, so that we weren't introducing anything alien. And that was a key consideration in everything we did, nature-based solutions. We planted these adult hard clams, and then we got the authorities to agree that they would be closed to fishing so that the clams within them could grow, reproduce, and hopefully not only clean up the water by filtering the water, but their offspring could help to replenish and restore the clam fishery outside the boundaries of the sanctuaries. We also constructed oyster reefs, and we reseeded eelgrass. So after 10 years, I have to say that none of us knew for sure that this would work. We thought it was worth a try. Things were so bad that we felt we had to do something. But after the restoration, we started to see positive effects. Within a few years, we went from half the bay being closed because of red tides to only a quarter of the bay having to be closed, and we have not seen any closures required, no red tides since from 2019 on. So that problem seems to have been controlled. The water quality improvements meant that the water no longer looked like a spilled cup of coffee. Sunlight was able to penetrate through, and the eelgrass reseeding succeeded also, and we now have almost 100 new acres of eelgrass in Shinnecock Bay. The hard clam population, what we saw there, really exceeded our expectations. Not only did the clams planted in these no-take zones survive and reproduce, but they reproduced to such an extent that there was what we call spillover to the areas outside the no-take zones, to areas that were traditional clam fishing areas. And now the hard clam fishery is back to where it had been. We haven't seen anything like this since the 1970s. So there's been an incredible increase, not only biologically, but economically in the region. And here are some of my favorite fish. These are menhaden, also called bunker. They've been called the most important fish in the sea. So many other species feed upon them, seabirds, other fishes, marine mammals. And these fish have made a huge comeback, increasing in abundance by about 4 times during the 10-year period. So today, Shinnecock Bay stands as a beacon of hope, an example of something that, despite the fact that we're always hearing, and it's true, we're in the midst of a crisis. We're in the midst of twin crises in terms of climate change and biodiversity declines. Here's a place where we've been able, through nature-based solutions, through science-guided work, to turn things around within a decade. And if it can be done here, it can be done elsewhere. And not just with clams, and not just with harmful algal blooms, but with all kinds of problems. So now we see very diverse and abundant aquatic life in Shinnecock Bay. You know, many of you probably didn't know we have seahorses. We even have a temperate type of coral reef that is natural and lives in Shinnecock Bay. Lots of different species of fish. Endangered species of seabirds and other birds are now recovering and thriving around Shinnecock Bay. And we see marine mammals such as bottlenose dolphins and seals. What we're looking to do in the future is to engage much more closely with the Shinnecock Nation, with other stakeholders, and to have what we call an all-Shinnecock synoptic expedition so that we more fully understand what's at stake, what we have, and what we need to do going forward. And we're hoping that we can begin this in 2023. So to wrap up, you know, we have experienced something pretty remarkable, something that was really beyond what I'd hoped for. And what I want to bring to you is that this is hopefully something that you can take away and say, you know, These problems that we're facing are really serious, but there is hope and there are things that we can do. And I'd like to thank all the various participants in this project and all of the supporters who have made this possible. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Next, we'll have Shavonne.
So good afternoon. Once again, my name is Shavonne Smith. I'm from the Shinnecock Indian Nation. I'm a tribal member and I serve as the environmental director. I did not prepare a PowerPoint. I am not an artist and I'm not a scientist by trade, though I was a biology major a long time ago. So I serve the nation in the capacity as the environmental director, and a lot of people ask me what exactly does that mean. So essentially, the Shinnecock Indian Nation has its own government, and it's a sovereign nation, and it carries out the functions that it needs to protect the people, protect the land, and continue our existence forward. And so, in a sense, you could see the work I do as a smaller version of the EPA. And so that's my role. I try very hard to engage with tribal members, engage with other neighboring communities, do outreach. I'm continually learning, continuing developing my own personal skill so that I can better serve my community. I would like to say that, back in 2015, we did start a coastal restoration project of our own, and it was funded through NIFWIP. And so we received over $3 million to do some restoration work along Shinnecock shoreline. For people who don't really know that much about Shinnecock Indian Nation, I'm going to tell you that it is I say this all the time, it's a shrinking peninsula. We live on a shrinking peninsula with a migrating wetland, and we're running out of space for the number of tribal members that currently live there, for the number of tribal members that call it homeland, and to be able to have somewhere to come back to, for the number of children that are being born now and will continue to be born. So when we talk about our connection to place, and we talk about land acknowledgement, and we acknowledge that the Shinnecock used to go all the way from East Hampton all the way out to the Brookhaven, and we now take a look at where we currently are. We're blessed to have that space. We are spiritually, culturally, emotionally tied to our place. And we, it's something every day that you have to be realistic about. So when we talk about climate change, we talk about the rising sea level, and we talk about eroding shorelines. So we have tribal members who have homes along the edge of the peninsula. When they built their homes, were not necessarily as close to the water as they are now. So in my job, it's also my responsibility to try to work with federal agencies to develop climate change adaptation plans, shoreline mitigation plans. Like, how are we really going to address what's happening? Because the truth of the matter is we can't stop it, right? We can't stop it. It's something that we have to learn to live with. So they say adapt, right? We have to build a resilient community, resilient in the sense that we know that it's happening, but what can we do to continue to exist there and go with the flow? Because, when we talk about, a couple of years ago, I participated in a panel. Oftentimes you get asked to speak and you find yourself in a room where the experience isn't shared, right? So they talk about things that are so easy as managed retreat. Even just to call it managed retreat, right? It's not that simple when you're talking about a whole community of connected people that are tied together by blood, tied together by place, tied together by a common history and that common thread. And so to just say that you would move to a new neighborhood is not really, it's not realistic, because that's a lot of land that we'd have to have access to. We'd have to have the money to buy it. I don't believe that anyone is just going to magically give us land. And when you change your location, you also change a sense of who you are. So we live on a shoreline, and, I appreciate the discussion about the commercial value of shellfish, right? The commercial value. But it goes deeper than that, right? So I always like to talk about something as very simple as the clam, right? The quahog, the paquahog, right? It's a clam. It's food. But in a way, it captures the Shinnecock culture in one thing. Because you take that clam, which is grown in the water, and you harvest it out of the water, and you use it to nourish your body, nourish your soul. But then the shell, you can turn the shell into jewelry, so it becomes decorative. Early on, when kids are young, sometimes we teach them in the cultural programs, we take those clam shells and you fill them with dried beans or stones, and now you've made a hand rattle, you've made a musical instrument that they can use during socials. A clam shell could be a tool. You could use it to scrape and dig, and our ancestors did. And so when I think of the clam, I think of how important and how much it represents the culture of the Shinnecock people where they are today and where they have been historically for thousands and thousands of years. And so when we think about climate change, we think not just of sea level rise and shoreline erosion and migrating wetlands and the loss of species, while we have the other plants and insects and animals that didn't previously live there that are now coming there because of the changing weather patterns. But we also have to be mindful of the potential of ocean acidification and what happens if the water changes so much that that clamshell is no longer able to survive and it's no longer able to harden and continue to live in those waters that you're working so hard to restore. And so it's just things like that that I think sometimes are not in the forefront of your mind. It's easier to and it's easier to think, not easier, I don't want to use that word, that's not what I mean. What comes to mind first is storms and flooding and, the loss of businesses and the loss of human life. And I just think it's also important that we recognize that there's also, for some communities and some people's existence, is the potential of a loss of culture. And it's becoming more and more, it's like the people in Alaska, I think, are really like what is catching the brunt of this early on. But a lot of times, we're gonna be honest, when they talk about climate change in the Arctic, it's not about the people, right? When they talk about the cold regions and the glaciers melting, it's not necessarily that they're talking about the indigenous populations that live there. And I just think that it's important that we always are mindful in those discussions that there are people that oftentimes will feel the impact first, and they'll feel it greater, and they don't always have the resources to be resilient, to respond, to just move, to get a new address, to build a new home. And a lot of that ties into, environmental justice, environmental racism, and they're just discussions that have to be continually had. And whenever I have the opportunity to speak, I don't only speak about the experiences of my tribe, but I like to also be mindful of some people and other tribes and even just other minority communities, because the climate change impact is not just going to be felt in major, how do I want to say this? It's not just in indigenous communities are not the only communities that will feel the impact differently than the mainstream society. We have smaller pockets of, I hate to use the word minority, but it's the reality. The poorer people who live in areas, okay, here we go. I'm gonna give you this story. I went to Charleston, South Carolina. I recently became, and I won't talk too much. I'm shy at first, but once I get comfortable, I talk. So I recently went to Charleston, South Carolina, because I became a member of this committee, and it's the EELC, and I really had no idea what it was, and I kind of still don't. I was asked to be on it, and so there I was. But one of the places that we went to what's known as an environmental justice community, right? So EPA had given funding to this community to basically do some planning and help them with their situation. The situation was, and the reason why I'm sharing this story is not only because of the environmental justice, but because it reminded me of a reservation. So it was this small neighborhood with roughly 600 or so people in it, all black community, mostly older people and younger. Why? Because that middle generation couldn't find jobs, so they were leaving. They would go to school and then they would leave, and they would not necessarily come back to the community because there wasn't employment for them. The situation was the community was kind of towards the edge of the city. And what the city had done was they built a sound wall because the highway passed through. And at first glance, you're like, oh, that's a great idea because now the traffic's not going to bother them. Wrong. When it floods, the water's getting trapped there. The city paved the road. Wonderful. Wrong. They covered up the drains, didn't replace the drains. So now they've actually created a situation where there's flooding that's occurring and the people don't have any, there's only one road in and one road out. And while they thought they were making improvements for the other people in the city, they actually were compounding the problems of this one small community that had lived there for generations and generations and generations and did not have the socioeconomic status to, even participate in town meetings to say, hey, this is what's happening to us. And that's a part of the real discussion too. A lot of times the people that are impacted by climate change and the mitigation efforts of neighboring communities do not have the opportunity to speak, or sometimes the know-how, how to speak, to say this is how this is impacting me. And so I just, I won't go on anymore. Take from that what you will. I hope you can get something from that. But I just think that that's the type of thing that always has to be a part of the discussion. We always have to be mindful of the people who don't necessarily have the voice, who don't have the microphone at the time, and we have to speak up for them, because collectively is the only way we're going to get through this. And I think that's the important thing, is collectively. We have to work together. Sometimes it feels like our efforts are not always as matched by our neighbors. And that's a political discussion. I won't get into it. But thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Shavonne. Now we will turn to Courtney.
So I just have to say thank you to Shavonne, very much so. And also to acknowledge that this is my first opportunity to be on a panel and a stage with someone from my community. And it has been a long journey of mine in this hope that we would have this time together. So I just really want to say thank you. I'm going to get emotional. But it is because of everything that Shavonne had just expressed. So we are a pretty prolific and powerful community that I am proud to be a part of. And we all are doing our best with the time that we have. So my time has been a long journey. Maybe not that long, but I do think maybe in before lives and maybe in future lives. But I came across this word breach earlier on, probably in about 2008 or 2009. I was looking at English language as being this language of imposition for our community, because at the time we have been, for quite some time, generationally working on language revitalization. And I was trying to think of what does it mean to go through that process and continue to use the English language. And also I wondered if people who use the English language actually know how they use it. So words are really quite interesting and quite deep and quite powerful. And sometimes we negate the fact that one word can hold many different meanings. So breach came about probably after that exploration, where the first word that I was exploring was the word contact. I was invited to respond to Henry Hudson's discovering of the river that we used. So I made a piece called Contact, where I physically pressed my thumb in clay over about 2009 times, because that was the year that they were marking it. And I mapped out the territory of New York. But at the time, I was looking a lot at Dutch Delftware for my entry points into that. I was thinking about the rivers. I was thinking about the land. I'll come back to that a little bit later, but it does connect exactly to what Shavonne had just expressed about our connection to shells and where I am currently today with that work. But when I looked at the word contact, contact can also be, and I'm dating myself a little bit, but before you had your contacts in your phone, there were Rolodexes, and there were people that would make physical contact, and there were all these different ways that you could establish contact. And then when I came to, artists in Western society, we have to explain ourselves. We have to give titles and labels, and sometimes Indigenous artists have to over-explain ourselves to the point that I question if anybody actually gets an opportunity to have true thought in that space. Is there a point where maybe we're saying too much that we don't give people that come into the space enough time to be themselves and to present themselves? And so I kind of would oppose the curators and the historians that would ask for more. I was like, I'll just give them a word. Let's see what they do. So Breach came about because I was thinking of home. And I was thinking about our rising waters, which I had witnessed because my grandma's allotment is by Shinnecock Bay. So if we have any high tides, high moons, hurricanes, it comes close. And that part of Breach was something I was thinking about, but I was also thinking about the first time that I was with a whale was in 2005. A 40-ton, 50-foot finback whale had washed ashore on the Dune Road side where all the mansions are. And then we have Shinnecock Bay, and then we have our peninsula that we have left. But traditionally, that was our summer territory. It does not make sense to be by the water in the winter. So we were further inland. But when you're in this imposed fixed position, which is another component of Breach, we don't have, as Shavonne had mentioned, options of movement. But we were a moving people. So I was thinking about that whale, and that was in 2005, but when I first used the word breach was probably 2013 or 2014. And I had made a palette of sperm whale teeth that I called breach number 2. And the reason why I made that palette of sperm whale teeth was at the time there was a large conversation about the ivory industry and wanting to take action against elephants and ivory and the impact that that industry has placed on elephants. So I believe in Paris at the time, they had brought out portions of the royal collection to the courtyard and decided to make a stance, a visual stance, and they put it on a blue tarp. I remember that color, blue. And they piled all the ivory and they crushed it. And I thought back to that time that the whale came and we were not federally recognized. Although we have been here and not removed, that federal recognition I really could care less about, aside from some of the issues I'm going to present today. The whale is federally protected. The whale is a part of our culture and our community. What happens when you have a species that an outside government is telling you you cannot access legally? So I started to think about that. I'm a thinker, I guess. And I thought, what do I have access to? I have access to clay. So I started fashioning these sperm whale teeth out of clay, and I placed them on this palette, and I was thinking about the import and export of material. And I was also thinking about that finback whale. Now, a finback whale is a baleen whale. It's not a toothed whale, but traditionally our community had harvested whales that would come close to shore. We didn't have to go offshore because there was plenty of them. And we harvested sperm whales, northern right whales, finback whales, minkies, porpoises, seals, and we were blessed and have been blessed. But with this imposition, that finback whale I translated to the sperm whale teeth, and thinking about that finback whale was struck by a shipping boat. And the majority of our goods are coming through our import and export into these ports and striking these whales. Now, I'm going to be mindful of my time, but when people want to support organizations like Greenpeace and PETA, they have been some of the most violent organizations towards Indigenous communities that are stewards of those specific locations. Sea Shepherd in particular, and Paul Watson, cyberbullied an Inupiaq youth after they had hunted a whale, which is a part of their culture and a part of their community and a part of their food sovereignty. Now, there's a lot of layers to the idea of protecting a whale when you're attacking Indigenous people that protect whales. And you don't actually know that how do you get your food into those territories? If there is not frozen land, then there's an immense amount of lagoons like Maine. There's just water areas, so it has to be frozen in order for trucks to get through there. If the food can't come on a truck, not like reverting the idea of harvesting local, and harvesting local is somewhat plants, but more so your whales, your polar bears, your seals, the things that kind of become these symbolisms of don't harm those things. But it's okay to harm Indigenous people in some sort of fashion. I think Shavonne had talked about this a little bit. I like to think of it as a metaphor. Everybody wants to save a polar bear, but not many people thought about the cyberbullying of that Inupiaq youth that Paul Watson did. Everybody wants to save a whale, but not that many people listen to Shinnecock people. So I use the whale as a metaphor to kind of enter into a space of hope and amplification for the voices of our community and the things that we're facing. But I don't necessarily offer as much as I'm offering to you today and how I do that. So I made a palette of teeth. It's representing what hit it, what struck it, and it's also representing an opportunity of access, and I leave the teeth pretty bare. And that was breach number 2. That's an image of Hurricane Sandy as it flooded over Dune Road. That was a shack kind of closer towards the Peconic, the bridge basically in Hampton Bays. Then I'm looking at underwater coastal restoration projects. So those are made out of rebar. They send electricity to them as a calcium attraction for coastal coral reef to grow and grow on these rebar. So I look at these projects and I think about the material use of how we're trying to ask nature to fix itself. We never, as humans, actually stop what we're doing. We just say, oh, here's a Band-Aid, go fix yourself. Not like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have cut you in the first place. And the Band-Aid that we give are actually foreign materials. So we have steel, we have plastics, which are microplastics and which are harming our areas that we're trying to fix. So I do think of like, what could those alternatives be? Like, where am I pointing this to? It's like, move it. Thank you. So that's the palette of spermal teeth. Ironically, I need water. So that's the spermal teeth that I was referencing. That's the finback whale. At the time, I don't actually know what I'm doing. I kind of go with the flow and I go with what I see and I do this kind of call and response as to what I'm witnessing that year. So when I started with Breach eventually became these logbooks because that's what was kept on those tall ships. And so every year I'm taking a different account of what I'm witnessing. So at that time, I had not entered into Breach. What I did was I had almost died. I had put myself in a vehicle underneath an 18-wheeler, and I had to be cut out of that vehicle, and I was flown to Stony Brook, and my mother was there when I woke up, and I had to learn how to walk again. And when I was learning how to walk, that's when that whale came. And I had gotten to the point of crutches. And I was also working at the Long Island, Southampton campus before it's transitioned. But I was there working with Dr. Strong, doing Algonquin pottery and a cross-linked course with him, and also Phyllis Cutter-Sullivan that ran the ceramics program there as well. So we were doing a co-teaching component. So I asked my mom to go grab a bag of clay, and if she could bring it out to me, and I sat with the whale, and I coiled a whale tail, which was some work that I was doing at the time. I was thinking about the whales, turtles, our different clans and relationships. So I sat there with the whale and I coiled that maquette. And what I want to say about being with the whale was that people asked me if I was sad. And I didn't have any feelings in the moment of being present. I think the action that I can offer to all of you is to be present. And not necessarily know why, but just to be. Because sometimes when you're just sitting there and you're absorbing, those answers possibly come way later, and they're so full of blessings when they do. But I don't think you should ask more of the time that you have in that presence, because it can maybe lead you in a direction it wasn't intended for. So I just sat there, and I am so blessed that in that moment, somehow it's led me to all these other moments that then led me to be here with you all today. If you could go to, so another translation is when you pile an amount of teeth, I equate that to microaggressions. That sometimes people are like, why don't you just get over it? Because that was such a long time ago. Or as Shavonne had mentioned, the environmental racism that our community faces, as well as just racism in general. The way that people tactively do that is to try to erase the people so that if you don't exist, then the idea of land back is not really relevant. And so we just need to tell them that ain't happening. We've been here a long time. So in thinking about the whale as a metaphor, I took the pile of teeth and I brought them out. So they represent 48 teeth in the lower jaw of a sperm whale. And when flanked on the bed of sand, which is also part of that import and export and extraction to build those coastal restoration projects, that maps out about 15 by 15 foot of space in a gallery. You can go to the next one. This was when the Mehedan were herded by the larger predatory fish in, I guess it was 2016, we had these supermoons. So when we talk about indigenous knowledge, it's in relationship to a different kind of lunar cycle than other people may have an understanding of. So we pay attention to the moon. The moon tells us when high tide is coming, but the infrastructure of what happened in Hampton Bays and Canoe Place was that when those predatory fish had moved those Mehedan into that area, those levees closed and they did not open. And so that made it so that they had no oxygen to breathe in a very small and confined space. And then they all died. And then they had to go somewhere when they released the dead fish. And guess where they went? Where'd they go, Shavonne? And Shinnecock did not have the wealth and the infrastructure that some of these practices are able to access. So although there's this idea of allyship and stewardship and environmental action, what happens to indigenous communities is that we are in competition with the people that are also applying for these grants and these environmental actions and these abilities to help and fix things. And we don't have enough people in our community to put that much labor into these initiatives, to fight for something that we rightfully deserve to protect our community and our land and our water. So we sat with the rotting fish, and some of us tried to use it for fertilizer in other ways, but we had to sit through the stench, and other people had resources to do it in a different way. So I formulated this series called Abundance, which I made a basket out of clay. These are all coiled. And I placed them on a contour elevation map on a wall, thinking about how baskets would be stored traditionally, like on the wall. After you use them, they dry out. And I use clay as this conversation of environmental fragility, because clay can be both very permanent and powerful, but it can also be fragile. You have to be careful. You have to hold your hands in a certain way. I'm asking people to be careful and to think about fragility and a connection that you will take care and mindfulness. If you can go to the next one. I will hurry up, but I hope you understand there's a reason behind my time. But Shavonne pretty much said it all. This is that import and export. That's what our port systems look like when shipping containers are coming through. The magnitude of those ships are so huge that they never see some of the most gigantic whales when they hit them and they're stuck on their rudders for thousands of miles. I made a series called My Burden Studies, and that was because I was in California. I was at Pomona, and there's a large history of shell trade for indigenous communities going down to South America and up the coast. And so that was an iteration that I had done at that time. If you could go to the, I thought the word burden was interesting because for indigenous people, if you're carrying food to feed your family, it's not a burden, it's a presence of care. But that word burden was given to that basket series by an anthropologist, not indigenous. I had done this series at NYU called Collider. It was looking at Brookhaven's opening up of the collider, the ion collider, which is an immense amount of magnetic power on an island. So what does that do for our interspecies relationship? But I want to talk about the shells. I got the shells from Governor's Island. There's a project there called Billion Oysters. And they do it through the harbor schools. It was my first time going to an island that shells were kept behind a fence. And their policy is that you have to check out the shells from their shell library and you have to give credit to the Billion Oyster Project. So I hope they know that I'm giving them credit right now. And then they take all of those oysters and they put them into the rebar, and they apply for those grants in the inner cities, and then they put them out for coastal restoration projects. Now, as a visitor, I had asked, could I keep the shells? If I wanted to keep the shells, I would have had to pay $75 per 5-gallon bucket. Where do you think they got the shells from? How many of you have eaten inner city shells? The shells come from the East End, they come from my territory, they go to the restaurants in the city, and then they're distributed. Then they're picked up by volunteer trucks for Billionaire Oysters nonprofit organization, and then they are siphoned off through taxation. And this whole system, I'm just offering it to you, not that it's not a great project, not that it's not doing good stewardship, but that this system is fucked. It is. This is a capitalistic privatization of allyship towards environmental issues, and it needs to stop. If you can go to the next one, I don't know where I'm at right now, but I do want to acknowledge that Indigenous people cannot do it alone, and I do learn a lot. And a part of my bridging out was that I was invited to be a resident home at the Andy Warhol estate through the Nature Conservancy. But really, I was invited to go through private bushes to get to the beach a little easier. And when I was there, I followed Mike Martinson around, who has Montauk Pearls. And I believe he was also a friend of Mike Dole, who works at Stony Brook. And when I followed him around, he showed me the extent of what it means to be a bayman and to harvest from 4 in the morning till midnight and then take those fresh shells to the city in order to keep your boat and to keep it going. But those shells do help with the ecology of that bay. So when we talk about ecological stewardship, it is many hands involved. It's Indigenous people, it's Shinnecock for generations, but it's many people and it is hard, cold work. But people do it because they love it and they do it because they want to protect the water. And when I was out in the early morning with him, I saw that egret on that ghost trap, and it led me to do a series that I installed at the Hood Museum that was up for 2 years called Nebulous. And I was thinking about the cloud or the haze that egret had offered. Can you go to the next image? That's another, it spans about 50 to 40 feet of an installation space, floor to ceiling, looking at the pipes and infrastructure that you see when coastal restoration occurs. It reveals that we used to have red clay pipes, but nobody wants to put red clay pipes in because the tree roots break them. So now we have plastic pipes and we have metal pipes. And how did we have Flint, Michigan? Where did the lead come from? It was a combination of water, and it was a combination of those pipes. If you go to the next one. I'm getting to the current installation, which you can see in the gallery, and I use the word cull for this work. You can cull a herd, but you also cull the shell, the oyster shell, in order for it to go to be chosen at the restaurant. So that's the word cull. Now, if you go to the next image, I'll show you where I get some of my observation from. I went down to Somas on the other side of the Shinnecock Bay, and I was looking at the greenscape of that area. And from an aerial view, looking on Google Earth, which is really not very private, it's very public if you think about access. Anybody can see where you've lived a couple years ago. That's where I got the shape from, and then the oysters that are kind of floating through that harbor shape in an abstracted way. If you can go to the next one. My daughter came out, and Michael Dole was really great, and he opened up the space, no fences, for us to access the shells, and I didn't have to pay a dime. So I will say I appreciate that experience. But when you collect shells, if you can go to the next one, you gotta clean them. So we spent about a week, my daughter and I, scrubbing those shells and then letting them dry in the sun on Shinnecock so we could take them here for the installation. If you can go to the next one. And I will have to say that if I could, as an Indigenous Shinnecock person, not have to think that I have the responsibility of holding so much labor, I would love to just be home and be on our shores with my daughter in all of her joy, like many of our community members are able to do. And those rocks that are there, that's through Shavonne's work and the environmental department and their coastal restoration project that they started with the Cornell Cooperative in 2015 to protect our shores and to protect our graveyard where our ancestors are from those areas. So I don't, personally, I live in Minnesota right now. I'm on tenure track at St. Olaf College. When you think about displacement and waters rising, if I had a choice, I would love to be closer to home. But I am also very grateful that I have the opportunity where I'm at, and I do the best with the time that I have. But there's a lot of complication, I hope you understand. We are not a non-intelligent community. We are a highly intelligent professional community, but we are very much underserved and underappreciated. And I hope that art can be and has been a means of power, communication, relationship building to get us to a point where the labor becomes less, the hope becomes more, and the joy can be the act of resiliency every day. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our presenters. That was really wonderful and rich, very rich. We want to give you the opportunity to engage with these amazing thinkers and organizers and scholars. So I want you to know that we'll be opening up the floor in a minute. And I invite you to take some time to think about what's on your heart and what's the question that you want to bring into this space. There's no rush for it. As we warm up the floor, I want to just start with one question for our presenters today. And I know we had talked about some questions, but I'm just going to shift it a little bit based on all that has been shared. So you can feel free to answer or not based on what's on your heart while we let people prepare their own questions. We had talked about the framework around emergency. being something that we want to talk about. But as I'm listening to all of you, I'm interested in the question of stewardship. What does that mean for you in your work? What does it mean to be a steward? So anybody can start.
I'm happy to start. So the word stewardship to me means taking care of. And in my work, I like to think, when I see problems, I like to fix them. I try to leave things in a better shape than they would have been without my being there. I think that when I look at the oceans, the bays, and all the species that live in them, us humans, we're just one species. And there are millions of species on this planet. And I think that someone's got to speak for all the other species as well. So I see my role, part of my role is to speak for the fish, to speak for all the other organisms that live in the oceans and in the seas.
When I think of stewardship, I'm guided by a set of rules that has been put in place by Dakota people. In our culture, it's called Wo Dakota, and it's basically how to be a person. And it outlines your responsibilities to your family, to your community, to the world, to other beings, outlines them very clearly. So I go back to that responsibility. But I also feel and think that in this time, Indigenous people are called upon a lot more to be speaking on these issues, and we've been through a genocide. So there are fewer of us than there should be. There are so there's like a weight of responsibility for all of those people who aren't here. And so that's very present in kind of the work that I do. Think about that stewardship, that weight of that.
Is there anybody else that would like to take that question? So the floor is open. We don't have mics for everybody, so what I'm going to ask you to do, if you can, is really project your voice, and then if I have to, I can repeat it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for sharing that. And I was thinking about, hello. I wanted to say thank you to Botany for what you shared. And I want to acknowledge the components of translation, that when we use the word Indigenous, that's not our word. We're really like the people of our respective places. And the reason why I want to talk about that in relationship to what you just shared is we really need to be mindful of our collective humanity and the experiences that we share that can be similar. But then also we need to honor and respect our individualism as people of a particular place and understand that some of those layers are much, not much more, but complicated in the same vein. I wanted to offer that so that I hope that what I'm hearing and what I understand is that those complications, I don't know how time relates to those complications, but power and hope and resiliency and joy. I don't know if you remember some of your best memories with your family and stuff, but sometimes people cope through laughter, and people cope through food, and people cope through music, and there's different ways that are part of culture that build our resiliency. And so those are the things that when I teach a class called The Art of Water, and it's looking at the idea of the art of war. Sometimes joy, laughter, music, coming together, those are parts of our ability to move through this imposed war. So I don't know if I'm making sense, but I just want to say that we're not all one people. that word Indigenous needs to be really mindfully used. But that I'm not familiar with your entire community, but I know people there that are doing hard work, and there's a lot of violence. But there's also, we got to hold on to the beauty. So I don't know if that meant anything, but I just want to say thank you ultimately.
Who else has a question?
Or a comment? Yes. I just wanted to point out, kind of, and I guess also the question, when you're kind of talking about the dichotomy of like Indigenous versus like Western culture, like it's just, I mean, I guess, the dichotomy doesn't make that much sense to me in terms of capitalism and whatever, because like America has so many immigrants of other cultures as well, and they've been also displaced, and they're not necessarily like part of the Western culture. I mean, I think we all are, but it's just, I think it's just more nuanced than just like these are the communities being affected. Because I think there's a lot of immigrants with a lot of different cultures that come in, and they probably have different understandings of the environment. And it's also just kind of sad too, because it's like a lot of the times they have to be refugees, things like that. I don't know, I just wanted to point that out.
Okay, great, thank you. Who would like to take that question?
I think I can just speak to that a little bit, that in the United States, that everyone who is here really does go through an assimilation process in order to be American, whatever that might look like. And so there's a lot of violence associated with that process for Indigenous people because of the ways that we, that are inherent to who we are, were targeted for destruction by America. And so that assimilation is something that, you know, is a common experience, I think, for Americans too. And so I appreciate what you're saying, but I think that it's important to understand the nature of settler colonialism, which is that America exists because of a genocide of Native people here, and that settlers here, are meant to displace and replace Native people. And so it's embedded within every institution of the government and every institution economically that be the case. And so it's really important, you know, to understand that for Native people, Indigenous to a particular area, that we don't want to assimilate. We want to do what we have always done. And we want to continue to evolve our culture that is, you know, it is in relationship to the culture that exists now, of course. It is but it is our culture, and it is unique, and it is different. And in many ways, it's more connected, too, because this is our land. We know this place. This is where we're from for thousands of years. So.
Is there anybody else on the panel that would like to speak to that? Thank you for the question. Thank you for the response. Did I see one last hand? Okay, we'll have one more speaker, questioner, and then unfortunately, I think we'll have to wrap it up. Yes, the floor is yours. Please speak up.
When you mention things like dealing with like Greenpeace or like the Greenpeace and PETA or like CSIPR, like with like how some environmental groups they focus more on like protecting the animal or the environment, but they ignore like the local people. Is there like since like I know like when Biden was elected, he made a big deal about like, environmental justice. Is there like for like future country projects needs to be like a way like balance out those needs to like protect the endangered species or environment, but also know that there are people who are tied with it and have a long history with it.
So if I can make sure that I got the question right, are you asking, are there other organizations that, along with protecting particular animals, also acknowledge the reality of Indigenous people and Indigenous life? Is that what you're asking? Yeah. Okay, good. So that this was in response to the questions about organizations and how they work as allies or not as allies in this environmental work.
I will honestly say, and I've traveled a lot, I have not found one yet that doesn't have some sort of component to areas of ethics that I would question. I would probably say that some of the best examples are coming from the direct people that are impacted and the organizations that they build and the work that they do. Because I think if you build and understand your local responsibility to place, you don't impose your belief systems on others too much in the examples that I've seen. I hope that makes sense. It's like, I'm not gonna come to your house and tell you what to do. So don't come to mine and tell me what to do. And ultimately what Sea Shepherd and Paul Watson has done is he has recruited people to be violent toward its Indigenous people. And I don't understand when they say, does violence beget violence? Like when they say, do we protest peacefully or do we, how do you, I don't know those answers. But what I can say is why is one body more valued than another? And so I'm not gonna be able to give you an answer, but I'm gonna ask you to think when you're looking at things, when you're researching, when you're reading an author. Do not ever take one person's sole voice, including myself, as the end-all be-all of your journey of learning and engagement and questioning the world. You have to think deeper, and you have to think more about, is this exactly what these people are saying they're doing? Or are they also trying to survive in a world that is very much fundamentally capitalistic? So that's where the complications come from. But I can't give you a direct answer to that question.
Thank you. Is there anybody else on the panel that would like to speak to that particular question? No? Okay, go ahead.
You know, I think I teach marine conservation and I work with a lot of conservation organizations. And I have to say Sea Shepherd is one of the more radical, probably the most radical organization in their tactics. You know, there's such a spectrum of environmental organizations that are trying to do good in the world, and I think there also is a lot more, in the time I've been working in marine conservation, it went from being a problem that the ocean could even have a problem was something that was unheard of, not too long ago. And then only a very few people knew about it, and now the field's exploded. There are all kinds of organizations, and we've learned how to do things better as time has gone by. So I do think that there are a lot of accusations of environmental groups being colonial environmentalists, going to places and saying, this is how you do things. I think for the most part, most organizations, they're not trying to impose their values. They're trying to help people understand the value of what they have in a broader context. They may be very familiar with the value locally, but not realize that on a global scale, these things are very important too. For example, if you have mangroves, just to bring it down to some particular example, if you have mangroves along your shoreline, you recognize what those mangroves do, but do you know that mangroves sequester more carbon inch for inch? These aquatic plants are powerful carbon sequesters, and people know that tropical rainforests are really important, but mangroves and seagrasses are more important on a per unit basis. So, yeah, I think that there are a lot of well-meaning people in the world, and that as time goes by, that these projects in other countries and other places with other peoples are becoming not only more collaborative, but the idea is to pass on the knowledge, pass on the responsibility, and pass on the future to people who live in these places. And that's what I see happening in conservation today.
I do not disagree, but what I want to say to you, I'm just going to say that was the most perfect example of Western science versus traditional ecological knowledge. What you said was, scientists, basically, people who know differently and more, will go to other places and pass on knowledge on how they should care for things in their area, because they may not know how important mangroves are. And that right there is part of the problem with the discussion in climate change. Thank you. Sorry. Not sorry.
So I am looking at the time, but we are hitting on something real. So I am gonna just bear everybody's patience and allow us to have this important discussion. Yep.
I'm going to pass the mic to my mother.
Okay.
When you had the question about Stewart,
Gotta give Mom a mic.
we don't have, thank you, we don't have, I can yell, I'll tell you, because I raised them, so. To answer the question of Stewart, that's not a word we have because that's our life. We are always taking care of where we're from. Not only because that is how we sustain and maintain and breathe our culture, but it's also what our ancestors expect of us and what obligation we have to the generations that come after. So I was not at all amazed that my indigenous, I'm Shinnecock, I'm Courtney's mom, that they didn't answer the word steward because, steward that's what we do. I mean, we get up every day and that is what we do. So that's a colonial word that's been imposed on our life. In all of your collegiate world now, there is a need to recognize indigenous knowledge and to give it the clout and the dignity that it inherently should have. And so to say that you come into an environment to teach us, that's just the wrong approach. When I was in college, the students would say, well, I'm going to get this degree and then I'm going to go and to the reservation and help. We didn't ask you? You know, William and Mary on their plaque on the college, they brought Native students to there to give them the degree. And when the elders from the tribe came, they said, you sent them back and they were not good for hunting, they were not good for fishing, so give us your young and we will teach them how to live and how to care for Mother Earth and how to survive. So these are not new things. I'm an elder. I pass the torch to them. But I can count times when people have come out to Shinnecock Bay and act like they're going to save it. And they already showed you what happened with the Manhattan when we had to breathe that. And so it is necessary in today's collegiate and academic language to give credit and accountability to the sanctity of indigenous knowledge. You've got fires out west. Native people were maintaining fires for generations. So go learn, understand things that we already know. Don't say that this nonprofit or this corporation is going to bring a scientist to teach us what we already know, that clam is suffering in that water because of homes in the Hamptons that people only live in 8 weeks a year. But they keep the water, the sprinkler systems running all year long to maintain their yards. So I'm glad you responded the way you did, Shavonne, because I would definitely have words with you at the end of this if you had not. But for Ms. Ellen, I hope you also understand the message that she was trying to convey. Yes, this is a collective endeavor. We all have work to do.
I do think so. I think we have a lot to sit with, and it's okay to sit. It's okay to think. It's okay to learn. It's okay to teach and be teachable. And I think that that's something we can all practice with this wonderful panel. So let's give all of our speakers another round of applause. And thank you all for coming out, being here. We have the reception in the gallery right next door, so we can continue many of these conversations. Have a wonderful evening.